Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that duty to this nation doesn't expire, hit like and subscribe, because what happened to the man you're about to meet should never happen to anyone who's worn the uniform. His name was Robert Kaine, Bobby, to his friends. And that quiet Tuesday morning, he wasn't looking for pity or glory. He wasn't there to relive old battles or flash medals. All he needed was to withdraw a few $100s from an old account, one tied to hazard pay from deployments the government still denies. He walked through the front doors of Summit Ridge National Bank like anyone would. Calm, composed, respectful. His cap, black with gold thread reading Korea Vietnam Veteran, had been carefully brushed clean. His shirt was pressed, though the cuffs were worn, and in his jacket pocket he carried a folded VA card, a pair of battered discharge papers, and a worn brass challenge coin. Bobby stood in line quietly, patiently, the way men from his generation do, as if waiting your turn. Still means something. But when he finally stepped to the counter, the tone shifted. The teller, no older than 25, blinked at the name and frowned. Bobby handed over his ID with a slight tremor, not from weakness, but from age and nights spent cold in forgotten places. "Just here to access an old account," he said kindly. "Robert Kaine. It's been a while." The teller smiled politely, typed, and paused. Something on her screen wasn't matching. She called for her manager. His name was Kaine. Hair. Slicked, tie crooked, smirk loaded. He glanced at Bobby's documents and gave a dry laugh. "You sure this is your account, sir?" he said, stretching sir like a joke. "This form looks like it came off a typewriter." The teller giggled. Bobby didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and placed a challenge coin on the counter. Brass, marked with a Thunderbird and 7 stars. Something no civilian would know, but every real operator would freeze at. Kaine didn't even glance. "Cute," he muttered. "They sell those online." Then he waved security over. "Another wannabe vet trying to scam the system. Escort. Him out." The guard hesitated. Just a second, but enough for Bobby to hear and for the bank to take notice. Some customers chuckled. Others looked away. Bobby didn't complain. He just picked up the coin, slid it into his pocket, nodded once, and walked to a bench near the window. There he sat, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing. The laughter faded. A cold silence took its place. Not guilt yet, something else. Unease. One person, though, didn't laugh. Maya Rodriguez, mid-30s, former Air Force logistics specialist, now in defense contracting. She'd seen a coin like that once, when a JSOC colonel briefed her team and every officer stood without being told. She walked to the counter and stared, down the manager. "You just messed up," she said. Kaine blinked. "Excuse me?" Maya pointed at Bobby. "That man isn't pretending. That coin carries more weight than any number in this building." Kaine scoffed. "If he's so important, why's he alone?" Maya didn't answer. She stepped outside and made a call, but someone else had already reacted. In a back office, an older employee, the kind who doesn't talk much but knows everything, had overheard the name Robert Kaine. He stood, walked to a brass plaque on the wall. It had hung there since the bank opened, honoring the builders of Summit Ridge Command Base. One name hadn't faded. R.J. Kaine, the very man who'd overseen the military design of the base before it became civilian land. The same man now being dismissed as a fraud in the bank his planning made possible. The employee said nothing. He picked up the phone, dialed a number few people knew, and spoke 6 words. "It's Bishop Kaine, Summit Ridge. He's here." Then hung up. Outside, Bobby sat still. He didn't reach for a phone or demand justice. He simply watched the flag across the street tugged by wind. He waited. Not for sympathy. Just because that's what men like him do. They wait until they're needed, even if no one believes them. Even while the world mocks them. What the bank didn't know, not Kaine, not Maya, was that in 30 minutes, everything would change. Because a few miles away, a general had just thrown on his dress blues, slammed down a phone, and was headed straight for the bank to make sure the man they dismissed would never be ignored again. The next 20 minutes passed slow, heavy. The teller kept her eyes down. Kaine paced, clearly unsettled, though unsure why. Bobby didn't move. Still seated, still calm, like a veteran of 100 waiting rooms. The challenge coin stayed tucked, away. The silence wasn't dismissal now. It was doubt. Maya watched from across the lobby, arms crossed. She'd called a retired command officer at Fort Brixton who changed tone the instant he heard Bishop Kaine and Robert Kaine. "He's there now?" he asked. "Don't let him leave." Something was moving. 2 blocks away, a black SUV sped through traffic. Inside, Major General Everett Kaine, decorated, disciplined, regional operations chief, and one of 5 men holding active bishop-level clearance. When he heard the name Kaine, he stood mid-briefing and told his aide, "Suit up. We're leaving." Kaine wasn't just a name in a file. He was Kaine's foundation, the man whose doctrine he'd studied. The fact that he'd been mocked, on land he once commanded, was not a mistake Kaine would overlook. Back at the bank, Bobby adjusted his sleeve. The buzz of fluorescent lights filled the quiet. A customer near the coffee station walked out, without finishing his deposit. A guard lingered near the door, unsure. Bobby hadn't raised his voice, but he still exuded the kind of authority that unnerves people who usually give orders. Kaine peeked over the counter. "He's still here," he muttered. "He's probably waiting to go viral. Bet he wants donations. Vets always pull that." Maya clenched her jaw. Even the teller looked ashamed now. Kaine leaned back. "Should've called the cops. Wait long enough, he'll make a scene." But then the bank doors flew open. Not gently, not by accident. Not a breeze. A presence. Boots. Real boots. Crisp. Commanding. Major General Everett Kaine entered, every medal shining, uniform flawless. Behind him, an aide held a briefcase. No one spoke. Phones dropped. Coffee spilled. Kaine froze mid-smirk. Kaine ignored everyone, locked eyes on the bench, on Bobby, then snapped to attention and saluted. The sound cracked through the room. Bobby looked up, surprised, but stood and returned the salute, steady and sure. Kaine turned and addressed the room. "Who called Colonel Robert Kaine a fraud?" he asked. Silence. Then again, "Colonel Kaine was vital to joint force doctrine across 2 wars and 14 silent operations. You questioned his identity." All eyes went to Kaine. He looked pale. I didn't know. His documents were so old." "Of course they're old," Kaine said. "Because he earned every year. While you were learning hashtags, he was building supply chains." The shame in the room thickened. Kaine's aide opened the briefcase. Inside, a thick folder marked classified, a commemorative coin, and a photo of the plaque with Kaine's name. Kaine placed it on the counter. "This bank stands on plans he made. That account, it funded the logistics you profit from." Kaine turned to Bobby, softer. "Sir, if I'd known you were in town..." Bobby nodded. "Didn't come for notice. Just need a little for my grandson's school." Kaine nodded back. "Then we'll take care of it." And together, they walked to the counter. Kaine stepped, back, silenced. The room had changed, reverent now. Every person understood they'd just witnessed something more than rank. Bobby withdrew his money in silence, no speech. Just folded the receipt and placed it in his pocket. As he turned to leave, Kaine stopped him. "Colonel, you've got 5 minutes." Bobby raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Kaine nodded toward the room. "For the honor you never asked for." And without a command, veterans in the room rose. From a young reservist to a gray-haired Navy corpsman, Even civilians stood, not because they were told, because they knew. Bobby paused, overwhelmed, then returned the salute with calm dignity. Kaine reached into his coat, pulled a velvet box. "Held on to this for years," he said. "Thought you'd want it now." Inside, a medal. Simple. Clean. Engraved with his name and 3 words. Service beyond record. Bobby stared a moment. No tears, no speech. Just a quiet nod, like something unfinished had finally been closed. Then he said softly, "I didn't come here to be remembered. Just came to keep a promise." Kaine nodded. "And you reminded us what service means." Bobby stepped into the sunlight. No cameras, no press. But inside, people stood straighter, spoke gentler. Later that week, a new line was added to the plaque. Below the dedication: Robert J. Kaine, Colonel, U.S. Army, honor in silence. No incident, no rank. But now, every person who enters that bank sees the name of the man they almost laughed away. 3 days later, Robert Kaine sat on a quiet bench overlooking the Ridgemont Veterans Memorial. Bronze statues of soldiers stood in still salute beside a wall etched with names. Bobby didn't visit often. He preferred quiet places, cornfields, back roads, diners where no one asked questions. But today was different. Today he wore the same jacket, the same black cap, and in his pocket, the velvet box that had finally closed a chapter. A school bus pulled up. A teacher herded 5th graders out onto the pavement. Bobby tipped his head low, expecting the usual. Kids too loud, uninterested. But one student broke away. A boy, maybe 11. Latino. Serious eyes. He approached, cautious. "Sir, were you in a war?" Bobby looked at him, surprised by the tone. Not mockery, curiosity. "2," Bobby replied, "but I don't brag about it." The boy sat down beside him. "My dad was in Afghanistan. He didn't come home." A pause. The kind you don't rush. "I'm sorry," Bobby said gently. "They gave us a flag," the boy said, "but not much else." Bobby nodded. "That flag means more than you know." Silence again. Then the boy pulled something from his jacket, a yasake, small frayed ribbon. He said if I ever meet a real soldier, I should give this to them. Bobby took the ribbon in his hand, worn from years of being folded and unfolded. He said real soldiers don't yell. They listen. Bobby blinked. For the first time in days, he felt the weight lift. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass challenge coin, the same one that had been mocked in the bank. He handed it to the boy. "Tell your mom. To keep this safe," he said. "It's been places." The boy looked at it, awed. "Is it real?" "As real as your dad was," Bobby said. The teacher called for the group to gather. The boy stood, then paused. "Thank you, sir." Bobby nodded, watching him go. He felt something shift, not loud, not grand. Just a quiet restoration of something that had been fractured. For a long time, Bobby had carried the weight of forgotten service, but now the weight felt shared. Later that evening, as dusk painted the memorial in gold and gray, a local news van pulled up. Maya Rodriguez stepped out, not in uniform, but with posture that still carried command. She approached with a folder in her hand. "They added you to the Hall of Valor," she said. "And Kaine wants you at Fort Brixton next week." Bobby waved it off. "Don't need ceremonies." Maya smiled. "Maybe not, but there's a young lieutenant named Alvarez who asked to meet you. His father was Staff Sergeant Luis Alvarez." Bobby looked up. The name landed like thunder. "I trained him in Panama," he whispered. "That boy, at the memorial." Maya nodded. Your reach goes farther than you think. Bobby exhaled slowly, then stood. He looked down at the velvet box again, but this time didn't open it. You know, he said quietly, we never wanted medals, just to know it mattered. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. It always did. Some people just forgot. They walked together in silence. No cameras, no ceremony, just the weight of service shared between generations. A new plaque would be installed the next day at the bank, commissioned not by policy, but by people moved enough to never forget again. And in quiet corners of Ridgemont, the name Bobby Kaine would be spoken in tones usually reserved for legends, not because he asked for it, but because some men remind us who we ought to be. 1 month later, under the tall oaks lining Fort Brixton's Southern Parade Field, chairs were set in even rows. No banners, no flyovers. Just crisp uniforms, sharp shoes, and rows of boots that had walked 100 different paths but now stood still in formation. At the front sat a single wooden chair, empty, facing the flagpole. It was for Bobby Kaine. He didn't want a ceremony, said he was too old for handshakes and speeches. But after what happened at Summit Ridge, people didn't ask him what he wanted. They honored what he deserved. The sun hung low, casting long shadows. Maya Rodriguez stood near the podium, scanning the field. She wore a dark suit, but her bearing was unmistakably military. She hadn't seen Bobby arrive, but she knew he would come. He was never late when it mattered. At 0900 sharp, a black pickup eased up along the road, and Bobby stepped out slowly. Same jacket, same cap. In his hand, a simple envelope. Inside it, his final donation to the Fort Brixton Legacy Scholarship. Enough to put that boy, Alvarez's son, through 4 years of engineering school. He walked to the chair at the front, nodded once to Maya, and sat. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just waited, hands folded over the head of his cane. Major. General Everett Kaine took the podium. His uniform gleamed, but his voice was plain-spoken. Today isn't about medals, he began. It's not about press or protocol. Today's about one man, and the weight he carried alone, quietly, for decades. He gestured toward Bobby. A man who never once asked to be saluted, but made us all stand straighter. The formation held still as the general continued, recounting missions that never made the papers, decisions that saved lives, service, records scrubbed for security and now declassified just enough to show the silhouette of a man who shaped more than one generation of warriors. When he finished, Maya stepped forward, holding a sealed black case. Colonel Robert J. Kaine, on behalf of the Defense Department, Joint Special Operations Command, and the United States Army, you are hereby awarded the distinguished honor of legacy service for actions beyond the record and a life lived in unwavering service. She opened the case and revealed a medal few had ever seen. Silver edges, deep blue center, and an inscription that simply read, "You carried us all." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence, like soldiers do at a burial, because respect, real respect, doesn't need applause. Bobby didn't speak. He accepted the medal, closed the case, and looked out over the crowd, not at the brass, not at the cameras, but at the young soldiers, the ones still learning what it means to wear the uniform. He tapped his cane once on the ground, then stood. "I didn't come here for awards," he said quietly. "I came here because I gave my word. And a man's word should still mean something." Then he stepped down from the podium, walked past the front row, and took a seat beside a young private who hadn't even been born when Bobby retired. The private stiffened, unsure. "At ease, son," Bobby said. "I'm just one of you." That night, back in Ridgemont, the lights of Summit Ridge Bank stayed on late. A small frame had been added to the wall beside the original plaque. It held a photo, grainy, black and white, of a young officer in a jungle, sleeves rolled, mud to his knees, and eyes sharp with duty. Underneath, it read, Robert J. Kaine. He never left the line. No one at the bank laughed anymore. Some even stood still when veterans walked in. And somewhere, in a quiet home near the edge of town, Bobby placed his cap on a hook, set the metal beside an old photo of his unit, and eased into his chair as the evening light spilled through the window. He'd kept his promise. And finally, at last, the country he'd carried remembered to carry him too.